Merhaba, ismim Günsu Engin ve Mindlight Mindfulness ve Şefkat Okulu'nun kurucusuyum. 2019'da kurulan bu okulda kendi eğitmen ekibimizle birlikte Mindfulness ve Şefkat eğitim programları vermenin yanında sosyal sorumluluk projeleri yürütüyoruz ücretsiz olarak ya da bağış usulü. Bugün izleyeceğiniz bu videoda bizim sosyal sorumluluk projesi olarak yürüttüğümüz Dharma Talks etkinliğidir. Ve bu etkinliğe dünyanın farklı yerlerinden ustaları, Dharma hocalarını, uzmanları davet ediyoruz. Ve tamamen ücretsiz olarak sizlerle Türkiye'deki Dharma öğrencileriyle buluşturuyoruz. Bundan önceki davet ettiğimiz konuğumuz Amerikalı Budist öğretmen John Halifax'tı. Onun videosunu, onunla yaptığımız sohbeti YouTube kanalında izleyebilirsiniz. Ve bu videoda bugün sevgili Doktor Paul Gilbert bizimle olmayı kabul etti. Yine tamamen ücretsiz olarak bu bir saatlik Dharma Talk'u yapmayı kabul etti. Bizler şefkati ve mindfulness'ı sığındığımız bir sığınak olarak görüyoruz. Bu dünyada her gün tanık olduğumuz zalimlikler karşısında aklımızı ve kalbimizi koruyabilmek için. Şefkate sığınıyoruz, mindfulness'a sığınıyoruz. Ben şahsen şefkati bir etik pratik olarak görüyorum. Yani şefkat eğer ki insana, canlıya, hissedebilen varlıklara zarar vermemek, onların acısını duyarlı olmaksa ve bu ortak yaşam alanı olan bu gezegende etik dediğimiz şeyde tamamen bu zarar vermeden bir arada yaşayabilme becerisini geliştirmekse, tamamen şefkatli olmayı pratik etmek de bir etik pratiktir. Bu ortak yaşam alanımızda ızdırap yaratmadan uyum içinde bir arada yaşayabilmeyi öğrenmek için. Ve soruyorum, şefkat evrimsel olarak hepimizin fizyolojisinde kodlanmış bir şeyken neden günümüzde bu kadar bu evrimsel beceriye erişmekte zorlanıyoruz? Eğer ki bu doğalımızda varsa, evrimsel sürecimizde varsa, neden iyi bir insan olmak, etik bir insan olmak bu kadar zor diye sordum Doktor Paul Gilbert'a. Ve giriş konuşmasını eğitmenlerimizden, aynı zamanda uzman psikolog ve Paul Gilbert'ın öğrencisi Şeyma yapıyor ve size Paul Gilbert'ı takdim ediyor olacak. İyi seyirler.
Geliştirilmesinde ve yaygınlaşmasında önce bir isim olarak şefkat odaklı terapinin kurucusu ve University of Derby'de İngiltere'de klinik psikoloji öğretim üyesi birçok başka uluslararası üniversitelerde de onursal profesör olarak çalışmış kendisi. Evrimsel psikopatoloji yaklaşımları üzerine araştırmalar yürütmüş. Özellikle duygu durum, utanç, öz eleştiri süreçlerinin farklı ruh sağlığı güçlüklerindeki rolüne odaklanmıştır ve şefkat odaklı terapi de aslında buradan doğan bir yaklaşım. Ve İngiltere hükümetinin depresyon için hazırlanan ilk klinik rehberlerinde yer almış, kraliçe tarafından üstün hizmet ve topluma katkının devlet düzeyinde tanınarak onur nişanı verilmiştir kendisine. Yine alana yaptığı katkılar nedeniyle Britanya Psikoloji Derneği'nin de onursal üyesi seçilmiştir. Birçok kitabı var, böyle onlarca kitap, yüzlerce makale. Bu kitapların arasında Türkçe'ye çevrilen Şefkatli Zihin kitabı da var. Ve şefkat odaklı terapi eğitimine yönelik kitaplar, atölyeler, uluslararası eğitim programları ile dünya çapında klinisyenlere eğitim vermeye devam ediyor. Ben de öğrencisi olduğu için kendim çok şanslı hissediyorum. Ve aynı zamanda 2006'da kurduğu Compassionate Mind Foundation'da da yine uluslararası düzlemde şefkatin bilimsel temelinin anlaşılması, uygulanmasıyla iyi oluşu yani iyilik halimizi desteklemek için de faaliyetler sürdürüyor. Bugünkü konuşmasında insan zihninin karanlık tarafı ve şefkat konusuna odaklanarak bizimle şefkatli bilgeliğini paylaşacak Paul. Söz Paul'da. So, Paul, we can listen to you. We are looking forward to your compassionate wisdom.
Okay. Simo, thank you so much for organizing this. That's what a wonderful thing. And it's a great pleasure, really, to be with you. And as you say, you've got a lot of people attending. That's amazing. So the question that was asked earlier was, why is it so difficult for us to be compassionate? Why is it so hard? And so that is something I'm going to address. And I'm also going to talk about this in relationship to the Dharma, because I know that's what you're interested in. So I'm going to talk a little bit from that point of view first, and then we'll have a look a little bit more at the evolutionary model of compassion. So let me now just share my screen with you one moment, and then we can do that. So there we are. So one moment, just on my screen share. Here it is. That's good. Okay, that should be okay. And there we go. Okay. Okay. Oops, sorry. Don't know where that's gone to. Where's it gone to? So share screen. Share my screen. Okay, can you see that okay?
Not right now. It was here a minute ago, but we can see now.
Okay. Can you see that okay? Okay, let me try again. Sorry about that.
No, still not here.
Again, let me come back here. Can you see that?
Yeah, okay. Right now we can see.
Let's come to the end of it. To the end of the talk. You don't want me to start at the end, do you? Okay, actually, that's not that one. That's not the one. Sorry, I beg your pardon here. Wait a minute. What's happened to mindset? There we are. Okay, let me just share this one. Okay, one moment. It should be okay. Right. Can you see that?
Yeah.
We've got the correct one now. Great. Okay, that's magic. So there we go. Right. Just make sure that's right. So, okay. So let me just get rid of this bar here. Get rid of this bar over here. 1 minute. There we are. It should give me opportunities to highlight it. Okay. Great. Okay. Okay. Is it okay? You seeing that now?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, great. Okay, 1 moment. Just go to my screen. Okay. Okay. So, okay, so here we go. So this is CFT for harmlessness, harmfulness, I should say. Okay. Okay. So can you see that now? I've changed the slide. Is that okay?
Yeah, it's the evolved mind and contemplative mind that
That's
you're
right.
seeing.
Okay, we've got it. Thanks so much. Right. So the first thing that we need to think about is, in terms of the Dharma, what does this mean in terms of our understanding about the nature of mind and compassion? Now, from an evolutionary point of view, an evolutionary approach to compassion understands the mind as having evolved, and that is linked to consciousness. And the view in the evolutionary mind is consciousness is partly created by biology. It comes out of your physiology, out of the way your neurons work, and also later on in evolution, we develop what we call self-consciousness or conscious awareness. And this part of consciousness is very important for mindfulness, our ability to pay attention to what's going on in our minds in a knowing way. However, in the contemplative traditions, it's a very different view. In the contemplative traditions, consciousness is the ground of all being. It is what produces physical forms. So consciousness is not produced by the brain. Consciousness creates the potential for brain. So out of consciousness comes subatomic particles, energy fields, and so on. And the nature of consciousness itself is regarded as empty. Consciousness doesn't have any form particularly. The Dalai Lama says consciousness is that which gives form, but is formless itself. And this domain of consciousness creates the laws of the universe, from the subatomic particles into atoms, into molecules, into proteins, into bodies. Okay. Now, the idea here in the Buddhist tradition is if you learn how to pay attention to your mind and still your mind and just pay attention to experiencing consciousness itself, you become aware that you can see through or past these illusions in biology. So rather than being caught up in feelings of anxiety or anger or greed or hatred, these are all produced by the biological brain. But if you can get into this meditative state of observing the mind, then you can begin to see past these processes. Now, this is important. This is very important because these are different ways in which we understand the mind and also biology. So in the Buddhist traditions, then, there is this distinction between what is called relative and absolute, ultimate or absolute. Now, bodhicitta refers to the mind that awakes up to the truth of reality by exposing our illusions and responding to our pain and suffering with compassion. In other words, we recognize that pain and suffering arises because we have biological brains. But behind those biological brains, or what is called our real nature or our ultimate nature, is consciousness itself, the ground of all being. And so the ultimate relates to this deeper truth of emptiness that underlies and permeates relative truth. Okay, that's important. Compassion arises from the insight and experiences into the illusions of an evolved brain and body. So although you are experiencing yourself as you, feelings and desires and wants and wishes, in the Buddhist tradition, those are all biological creations. That's not really what you are. What you are is part of consciousness. And these are just things that are happening in your mind. So this is important. Now, if we look at compassion, if we take a biological view of compassion, then compassion arises from the biological systems in the brain, things like oxytocin and the frontal cortex and so forth. Whereas if we take a Buddhist position, then it arises from meditative states, from deep insight into the nature of consciousness. So compassion arises from quite different places if we take a biological view or if we take a Buddhist, a contemplative view. The problem with the biological view is that the brain was designed for survival and reproduction. And as such, life, and indeed the human brain, has a terrible dark side. Now, the Buddha came to understand that part of the reality of suffering was to do with the continual cycle of rebirth into bodies. So part of what compassion was about is trying to get off of this cycle of rebirth, because rebirth involves being born, craving and wanting, suffering, decaying and dying, coming into existence, craving, wanting, suffering, dying. And all of life is caught up in this cycle of suffering, the suffering of biological life. And that's true if you think about it. All living things, they come into existence, they have to find food to survive and fight off predators, they can get diseases, and all living things eventually die. So the Buddha, the position was, can we get behind that? The problem with this system is that because we have the struggle of survival, we also have brains that can do some very bad things in the struggle for survival. So we know that even if you look at chemicals, hormones like oxytocin, for example, oxytocin is associated with strengthening social bonds, tending and befriending. So if you get oxytocin, that's very good. It makes you more loving and caring to each other. But we also know that, unfortunately, when it comes to between group, intergroup conflict, oxytocin actually makes us worse. We become more aggressive to outsiders because we can become more protective of our group. Oxytocin makes us more protective of our group against external enemies or hostile others. So oxytocin is a biologically evolved hormone, which on the face of it looks like it's going to be good for compassion. And it is, but only for in-group people, only for people you're close to. So this is important that we begin to realize one of the reasons that compassion can be difficult is because our brains have not been set up, have not been designed for us to be compassionate to everyone. And in fact, there are some individuals, people we don't like, for example, that we're definitely not compassionate to. So this is important. So the other point that we need to recognize, oops, where have I gone? The other point that we need to recognize that when we are working with the non-dual approach, the nature of consciousness itself, then this does not have that issue. This does not have the biological issue of being compassionate to some people, but not other people, because when you have the non-dual experience, you realize that as part of consciousness, consciousness is everything. There is no separation between you and anything else. Everything is part of the one. So this is important. Now, how did the Buddha get to this? Well, Siddhartha, who was the Buddha to be, spent a long time in various meditative practices trying to work out how to deal with the suffering of life. And he ran into many dead ends. He was an ascetic. He starved himself for a while. And tired and emaciated, he decided that the only thing he could do was to sit and observe his mind until he could work out what on earth was going on. What was it to be alive? What was it to be aware? What was it to have a mind? And so, as you know, he sat meditating under the Bodhi tree. And what happened was, in settling the mind, he had a breakthrough experience into a totally different domain, now referred to as non-duality, which is a form of self-transcendence. So this is very important, that when we have experiences of compassion that are coming from this process of training, this is somewhat different from training our biological minds. And there's quite a big history now of trying to understand the nature of the experience of compassion and the need for compassion when we understand that we are not just biological beings. Our biology is what, in a way, is clouding our mind. It hides the reality from us. This is the Buddhist position, because our biology just fills our head with desires and wishes and emotions, all of which have been designed purely for survival and reproduction. But all of those things that happen inside the brain can actually stop us from understanding our real nature. So that's the view. That's the view. And what happens when people have these experiences, they're called self-transcendent experiences, is they can have experiences like this. This is William James. I felt myself one with the grass, the trees, the birds, the insects, everything in nature. I exalted in the mere fact of existence, of being part of it all that I knew so well, of losing self and the perception of supreme power and love. This is Alan Watts. I felt I lost the boundary to my physical body. I had a skin, of course, but I felt I was standing in the center of the cosmos. And this is from Jill Taylor, and it's really worth having a look at her TED Talk about the nature of consciousness, because she had a stroke. She was a neurologist who had a stroke on the left side of her brain, and she had this overwhelming experience of non-duality, of being part of everything and everything part of her. So that's the kind of experiences that people have. Now, those experiences, when those experiences generate compassion, they're very different to the experiences that we create when we're working with the brain, when we're working with oxytocin, and so on. So this is very important. Now, one of the problems that we have to be careful about is that people often get these two things wrong. Well, but not wrong, perhaps, but they confuse them. And they talk about this idea that consciousness is our true nature, which it is, in a way, but that's very difficult for people to have access to. And there are all kinds of reasons why it's important for us to deal with our biological brains, as well as just trying to meditate into these states of awareness. So let's now look at the issue of evolution. That's what we hear. So we're clear, we got these two different paths to awareness, these two different paths to understanding what the nature of mind is. One is consciousness, the other one is related to the biological mind and evolved mind. Let's have a look at the evolved mind. So we know then that the evolved mind has come because of evolution. All living things are built by DNA. Sorry, was that somebody? Okay. All living things are built by DNA, challenges of survival and reproduction. And that means that we have 3 life challenges. All living things have 3 life challenges. And those 3 life challenges are the need to protect. All living things have to protect themselves from harm, otherwise they die, obviously. They have to acquire resources, food and opportunities to mate and that sort of thing. And they have to be able to settle and to reset their physiological systems. They can't just be trying to defend themselves all the time or trying to acquire resources all the time. They also have to rest and settle. And that gives rise to what we call the 4 functions of mind. So we have motives to protect ourselves, and motives to acquire things, and motives to rest. We have emotions that will help us to do that. So emotions that are linked to threat, for example, can be anxiety or whatever. Anxiety, fear, and anger. And we have competencies. These are ways in which we think. We can have empathy and mindfulness. These are all competencies, and we can have specific behaviors. Okay, so these are your, this is what life is about, survival and reproduction. These are the tasks of all living things, and this is what they need. They need to have a motive. They need to have emotions that will move them, fix their influence their body so they can do things, run away or whatever. They need to have ways of thinking about things, and they need to have ways of behaving. Now, what's interesting is, of course, that if you have secure attachment when you are young, then that will affect your motives, that will affect your emotions, and that will affect what you think. People who have a loving early life, they're more likely to be empathic. If on the other hand, you have trauma in your life, and this is going to be very important when we understand cruelty in the world. If you have trauma in your life, trauma will affect all 4 systems. So trauma will affect what motivates you. So sometimes people who've had a lot of trauma can be motivated by anger and vengeance. And we can see this in the world today. We have many leaders in the world today who have very traumatic backgrounds, and these are angry people who want power, and they do a lot of damage. So what you're wanting to do, obviously, is you're wanting to create compassion, because when compassion starts to operate in our brains, then it changes our motivation. We become motivated in new ways. We can become motivated to do new things. It affects our emotions. It affects how we think. It affects our ability to be empathic. And it affects what we do. So compassion then is not just about being nice or whatever. It affects our motives. It affects our emotions. It affects everything. And the reason for that is because we have a brains, and when our brains are working as they do, all of these things get affected. Now, what this also means is that all of us have got what we call a multi-mind. And this multi-mind, this issue of a multi-mind is very, very important, because what we now know is that a lot of our minds are made up of different modules, talents and policies and motives and desires. And all these components of mind can act actually relatively independently of us, and they can be in conflict. So you have a mind like this, and this is not new. This is from an old psychology book going back to 92. So it's over 30 years old, that you are a universe. You are a collection of worlds within worlds. Your brain is possibly the most complicated and amazing device in existence, in the universe, maybe. Through its action, you are capable of music, art, science, and war. Your potential for love and compassion coexists with your potential for aggression, for hatred, for murder. So one of the problems that humans have got, and it's a big problem, is our minds are capable of the most terrible things. And we certainly have been pretty terrible. And that's because we have the potential to be terrible. Now, what it means is then that our brains can create different types of brain state. So you can see that when we have a brain state, what that means is it organizes our brains in a certain kind of way. So for a competitive brain state, the way we pay attention, the way we're thinking, what's happening in our body, what our emotions are, will be very different from when we have a compassionate brain state. So the thing in compassion focused therapy is that we don't focus on one system. We understand how all of these are interconnected. So what you attend to will affect what you think, and what you think will affect what you attend to, and what you feel, and what you feel will affect what you think. So your brain operates as a system. It's a system. So what you're wanting to do when you're engaged with compassion is you're wanting to develop a compassionate brain, because if you can develop a compassionate brain, that will help a brain that can be more harmful. So the challenge for us really is this is the challenge for humanity, is to understand that we're all born into gene-built bodies and life context. Nobody asks. No, you didn't ask to be born in Turkey, a male or a female. I didn't ask to be born. I was born in Africa, actually. I didn't ask to be born in Africa. We just arrive here. Our consciousness just finds itself experiencing itself through you. Consciousness didn't ask for you. It just found you in you. So it didn't give permission. We are socially shaped without our knowledge or permission. The way you were shaped by your parents and your background, the religion that you took on, the values that you took on, the beliefs that you had about being a man or a woman, all of those things, you didn't choose any of that. You didn't get to 3 years old and think, well, you know what? I'm going to believe this and I'm going to believe that. No, it was all given to you by your culture. We grow up with vulnerabilities to injuries and diseases and losses along the way. And we all have to come to terms with everything we love will die and decay. And therefore, there is always what is called the hidden terror. We live with a sort of a hidden terror that mostly we dissociate from. And sometimes when you're working with clients, you can detect the rage and the depression about the way life is for them, about the tragedies of life, the suffering of life. And again, this is something we have to come to terms with. There's actually a whole school of psychology called terror management, actually. There it is. So the key thing then is we have to become aware of the nature of our minds, because although in the Buddhist position, the idea that compassion is the basic position of the mind, that's coming from a view about the nature of consciousness itself. When we look at the nature of the mind from a biological point of view, compassion is only one of a number of possible motives. We have a brain that can be extremely compassionate to certain people at certain times, but we also have a brain that can be pretty awful. That's really important. And so one of the ways in which we can understand compassion and the lack of it is because one of the issues, one of the challenges of evolution is to gain control over resources. Because if you can't control food or whatever, then unfortunately you don't do very well. And many animals create what are called power hierarchies. Sometimes this is over territories or ownership. And the dominant individuals, usually, but not only males, because females can be dominant with their own gender as well, they basically bully everyone else. So if you look at most primates, what you find is aggression is the way you get to the top. And once you get into the top, you hold on to resources. You don't share them particularly. But what happened to humans about 2 million years ago is a movement away from control and hold into what we call care and share. Now, this is a long story, but issues of attachment and the evolution of friendship was very important. And why that happened, again, I don't have time to go into that, but it did. So what it means is that we now have these two potential strategies within us, or motivational systems within us, which is to get hold of resources, to compete for resources, and then to hold on to them, not to share them. And if you look at a lot of people in the world today, particularly those individuals who tend to cause trouble, they are very much into this. They want power and they want to hold on to it and they want to accumulate resources. They want to become wealthy and so on and so on. Now, this is an old model. This goes back to the 1950s, that we can begin to think about how these different dimensions play out. So this is the idea that there are two basic dimensions to our personality. One is the dimension of dominance and submission, and the other is to be hostile or to be helpful, to be friendly, to be exploitative or to be helpful. See, these are the two dimensions. And then you get these four different things. So people can be friendly, they can be dominant and friendly, such as compassionate leaders or compassionate parents. These are individuals who are dominant, they have power, but they use their power to be helpful to others. Whereas over here, you have people who are dominant, but they use their power for control and hold, and they can be quite hostile. And we've got quite a few leaders in the world like this, haven't we, really? And then you can have that should be friendly, that shouldn't be hostile there, I'm so sorry. And then you can have hostile submission. Okay, so let's have a think about this now, because this is really quite important, because what we know is that the way in which culture works, culture can actually increase our abilities to be compassionate, or it can increase our capacities to be callous and cruel. And at the moment, capitalism and many of the ways in which we organize ourselves tend to organize us towards cruelty. And the problem is that there are gross abnormalities of modernity. We're basically evolved to live in small groups of about 150 with not much in the way of resources. We gathered and hunted and gathered, and we didn't accumulate very much, and we shared. And one of the interesting things was when humans invented fire or discovered fire, this allowed them to extend the day. And so humans spent a lot of their evening time sitting around campfires, because that not only kept them warm, but it also kept predators away. And in that time, they would be sharing stories and talking. And over hundreds of thousands of years, sociality became very important to humans. And we now know that sociality, friendships, feeling parts, feeling the sense of belonging is very important to the brain as well. The problem comes when you're not living in a small group of 150, but maybe 150,000 in a city. And many of these rituals that used to be every day of sitting around the campfire with your group and exchanging and feeling safe with each other, that doesn't exist anymore. Also, children used to be brought up by the community. There was no ways in which children would live in these houses by themselves with parents, and that parents could neglect them or beat them or hurt them. That just wouldn't have happened, because everything was public. So we live in a grossly abnormal society. And partly with the rise of agriculture, we moved away from caring and sharing to individuals holding on to resources. And we became very tribal. And if you look at human history, you'll find that mostly in the last 10,000 years, we've lived in terrorist states. Humans have all been controlled by terrorist states. If you look at the Egyptians, if you look at the Romans, if you look at the Vikings, if you look at some of the Chinese with their slavery, all of these societies had slavery and so on and so on, then this is a very dark side of humanity. Somebody's got a hand up. Somebody could put a hand up? Email? Okay. And the reason for really holding on to this is because you asked me, why is it so difficult for humans to be compassionate? And the reason is because we're living in societies that make compassion quite difficult. And in many ways, the fact that we are as compassionate as we are is quite amazing. And I'll look at that in a moment. Okay. So these are all things. The dark side is really been quite a problem to humanity. We're just beginning to come out of it now. You know, the British Empire was terrible. The British Empire did terrible, including this awful slavery. We had terrible slavery, but we're gradually moving away from that now. But we still have a lot of callousness because we know that there are children like this where we sit down to like this. We know that in the West, we throw away so much food. We know that we could share more resources, but we don't. We know that poverty in many parts of the world is terrible, whereas individuals in other parts of the world accumulate vast resources. We also, I'm not religious myself, but we have made suffering, the desire to create suffering through torture and the way we kill people. Humans have been terrible. We've been awful. What a terrible way to invent. If you want to kill somebody, kill them. But why do you want to do that? And that's partly because there's something in our brain that facilitates this, because this is not new, and it didn't happen to a few. There's probably millions of people who have died like this. And we also, of course, have used suffering and pain as entertainment. The Roman games were known for 1,000 years, and millions, not just a few, but millions of people died for entertainment. And if we look at our love of horror films, humans like to see horror films. This one is Fred on Elm Street. And if we look at the issue of the use of violent video games are quite popular. And here is a study looking at the effect that this was looking at 980 violent video game exposures had been shown to increase aggression in players. So if you play violent video games, it tends to increase your aggressiveness. The present study examined the idea that violent video games play does not only have an impact on the player, but also on the player's social network. In fact, egocentric social network analysis showed that playing violent video games is associated with increased aggression, which spreads among connected individuals. So this is really quite important, that there are many things in our society that are moving individuals, particularly sensitive individuals, towards increased aggressiveness and reduced empathic connectedness. I say sensitive because it doesn't happen to all. There are individuals who are don't go this way, but a percentage of them do. So this is kind of important. And the other thing is to recognize that this is just from a very interesting book on crime about how societies have actually been pretty bad. So this is from a history book, and this book, this is from Beattie's book. There is good reason to think that violent physical conflict and physical abuse were commonly experienced in the 17th and 18th century society. The family was the scene of much of it. The family discipline was commonly maintained by physical force, with society's concurrence. Men controlled their wives and children by beating them for transgressions. Wife abuse was really very common. Children at school and young adults in service were similarly subject to what was widely accepted as the necessary persuasion of the rod. So I won't go on with this because we don't have a lot of time. So you can have a look. I'll send you the slides. You can read it for yourself. But the point is that when we look back at history, actually, even our own individual family lives were pretty bad. Okay. So let's have a look at some of the other sources of harmfulness. Now, one of the sources of harmfulness is, as we've said, is control and hold. And one of the reasons for this is because many species are, including humans, engaged in hierarchies. And hierarchies, by nature, tend to be aggressive and can cause all kinds of problems. Okay, so here's another one. Okay, now the problem here is that when you are engaging in conflict, when you're wanting to win a battle, when you are competing with another person and they are beginning to experience threat, that turns off empathy in the brain. In other words, these individuals are not interested in the harm they're doing. In fact, they want to do harm. They want to cause threat, because that's how they're going to win. And that's very common in many species. So here we are, look. Here are some mountain goats, long, tall mountain goats. Sorry, Fred, I don't know why we're doing this. I hope I haven't given you a headache. Of course, they do this at a certain time of the year when it's breeding time. The males really go at each other for a month or two because the females put pheromones into the atmosphere, and that triggers this competitive behavior. It's not your fault, Joel. We are under the control of powerful evolved algorithms. So of course we don't like to think we're like that. We don't like to think that our brains are being controlled by these biological systems, but of course they are. And if we can begin to understand that, if we become mindful of it, that becomes such an important thing. And we're also familiar with the fact that we can be enticed to do very harmful things. It's very easy to get people to be harmful against others, particularly in other groups. And you can see around the world today, very tragically, that when you get tribal violence and when you get hatred, the capacity for empathy disappears. The brain simply does not process the suffering of the other. The brain simply turns off empathy. Those circuits in your brain for empathy get turned off. And hatred becomes a much more powerful motive for humans. The desire to create suffering rather than reduce it becomes, you literally become possessed. And here's an example to show you that war is not just about human behavior. Unfortunately, war is endemic in primates. Lots of primates go to war. These are two different groups of macaques.
She must find them out now and leave with the rest of the females. If Slumdog's catch her alive.
They would kill her.
Foot soldiers rush forward. They're hoping to hold the Slumdogs at the road. They cross it. They move to the woods.
Okay, so you get the idea then that unfortunately, as a primate, we have this potential for war. And when that aspect of the brain is triggered, humans go to war and they do terrible things. Let's be clear about that. If you look around the world today, when we are in tribal conflicts, terrible things happen. And tribal violence is probably often driven by aggressive males. They're often the leaders of it, they're orchestrators of it. And it's the biggest threat to our species. It's a real big threat to our species. It's been a threat for thousands of years, our tendencies to go to war with each other. And when we do, we become really nasty. Yes, people are asking for the slides. I would definitely give you the slides. Do not worry, I will give you the slides. So let's have a little bit a look at this because it's very important. Then we're going to be talking about compassion because I see I've got about 10 minutes or so. So we have a dark side of the mind, right? This is and the key thing about compassion is that we are sensitive to the realities of suffering. Okay, we don't just think, oh, we've got to be kind to ourselves and this person. No. Compassion is the ability to understand the dark side and the courage and wisdom to address it. That's what we have to do. If we just carry this idea, oh, we're basically good and nice, that's a Buddhist view. That's consciousness. That's not biological brain. Biological brain can be nice, but it can also be pretty dangerous. And therefore, we have to work with biological brain and recognize and see from history what happens. Now, biological brain also has the ability to be peacemaker, be interested in sharing and caring, the desire to heal. Humans can do some wonderful things. Think of medicine, for example. Think of people during COVID, doctors and nurses and other people, they risked their lives to save other people, and sometimes they lost them. So the desire to be compassionate is so important, so important. And these are all related to different brain systems, which are really important. And also epigenetics, and also it's important how culture works. And what is it that we cultivate? How do we cultivate this, or do we cultivate this? So really, it's about us as a species deciding what we're going to cultivate. And unfortunately, sometimes when we get into become very competitive, very focused on our own group, we can become, we turn this off. These systems literally get turned off in the brain. Now, another way we can understand this is what happens when we're young. Now, here's an example from Bruce Perry's work showing that if children are not loved and cared for example, in the cases of extreme neglect, the brain simply does not mature appropriately. And this leaves them with all kinds of deficits. So some of the problems we see in the world is because leaders with damaged brains are getting into positions of power. There's no question about that, I don't think, really. And if you look at the childhood of some of these leaders, it's pretty bad. So we know then that sometimes what drives destructive behavior is literally brain damage. Now, here's the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And we can see that this is very important for humans. And it was an area of the brain that evolved very much in the most recent, about 1 million years or a bit more. It was obviously there in other primates, but it's been really, really quite important. And this part of the brain helps us with moral judgment. Damage to this part of the brain, and this area of the brain is very easy to damage, particularly in children, can give you problems with moral decision-making. Lesions can blunt your affect, your capacity for empathy. So moral decisions and empathy and negative feedback, all of these things can be really badly affected if you get damage to this part of the brain. And this part of the brain is quite easy to damage, particularly with stress. And if children are being beaten or being shaken, this is not good for the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. It encodes values. It enables flexible uprating and positive. So it says these are some positive things that it does. Let me say this. We had a conference a couple of years ago where we were looking at the harmful side, and this was some very interesting data about brain damage, actually. And there's increasing evidence that individuals who have problems with emotion regulation and commit crimes have traumatic brain injuries. And these are children who often have been quite badly neglected or abused or whatever. So Nagala notes that about 12% or more of the general population may have suffered forms of traumatic brain injury. That's pretty high, right? Now, the point about it is, it's not just brain injury. The areas that it's going to be affecting, if you get brain injury as a result of stress and fear and threat, you're going to be affecting that those parts of the frontal cortex. But if you look at people who've gone into prison, been into committed crimes, it's between 27 and 54%. If you look at domestically violent men, their brain, their frontal cortex is not great. Okay, so this is very, very important when we begin, as clinicians, as psychologists, we begin to recognize the physiological aspects of harmfulness. That some form, not all, but some forms of harmfulness are to do with the fact that our frontal cortex is not working very well. Okay, I must move on a little bit. So now this is some studies showing what happens when people have a fear of compassion. This is just effect sizes. That's a good effect size. It's a medium effect sizes. This is taken from James Kirby's work. And what we find is that people who have fear of compassion for others, I'm frightened to be compassionate to you. I don't want to be compassionate to you. This is linked to depression, anxiety, distress, reduced well-being. If you look at the fears of compassion from others, In other words, you don't trust others to be helpful to you. You don't turn to others. Once again, what you find quite big effects on depression. And if you look at the fears of self-compassion, once again, you can find that when people struggle to be compassionate to themselves, this can happen. Now, remember that when you're getting these fears of compassion, you're getting these compassion inhibitions, things are happening in your brain. So this is very important. And if we look at styles of leadership, if we look at antisocial leaders and ruthless leaders and narcissism, what we find is that we've got very high correlations with the fears of compassion. So if you look at some of the leaders in the world today, particularly those that would be linked as narcissistic, these individuals are actually quite frightened of compassion. They do not like it. They see it as weak. They don't like the feelings of compassion, and so on. So that's kind of important. Okay, so I must kind of move in now. So the key thing is to find ways in which we can work with traumatized individuals to see that early trauma can be one of the reasons that individuals end up being very, very harmful. And then they can get control of groups and they can lead groups into being very harmful too. So how can compassion science help? Well, I think one of the things that compassion science can help, and I'm going to, this is the last part of my talk now, is to recognize that even though humans can be terrible, and we can be, today there are many places in the world we are vicious, we're a very nasty species, we can also be quite amazing. And that's because we have evolved to be very social. This book is a lovely book, Survival of the Friendliness. The problem with it is it's contextual. It's very important that we facilitate friendliness, we facilitate sharing, we facilitate understanding of each other, we develop empathy. It's extremely important. And ways in which we do that is, one of the ways in which we do that is to practice developing our own compassionate mind. Now, there are many ways in which we need to address the social dynamic. One of the issues of the social dynamic is through the rule of law. We know that because humans have this potential to be pretty nasty, we need the rule of law. And if you think about it, what's civilized us in the last 200 to 300 years, certainly in the various parts of the world, is law. Okay, the rule of law. And where the rule of law breaks down, like in some countries, humans can become very bad. So the rule of law is very, very important. But let's come back to the self. So the key thing then is developing your own compassionate mind. Now, you start off by developing your own compassionate mind because you recognize that through no fault of your own, you have a mind that can be potentially harmful. It can be harmful to you, and it can be harmful to other people. You have a mind that can experience anxiety and panic and depression and paranoia. You have a mind that can become very angry and lash out at people. You can have a mind that can become very tribal, and you're going to hate the group in the other tribe, people in the other tribe. So you have a mind that, through no fault of your own, because you didn't design it, can become very harmful. And if you think about it, everything that causes us harm, we don't choose. Nobody wakes up in the morning and thinks, you know what, I'm going to have a panic attack today. Yes, that's a good thing. Oh, I think I will practice being depressed. I'm going to practice having a suicidal depression. No one practices the dark side. The dark side just turns up. It turns up in us. It gets triggered in us, right? So all of those feelings we have, the feelings associated with mental health problems, they get triggered. But so do the feelings of anger and rage and hatred. Generally speaking, people don't choose them. People don't say, well, look, I'm quite a loving person, really, but I think I'm going to practice hatred. I think I'm going to practice violence. Generally speaking, most people don't choose the dark side. The dark side is triggered in them, and they don't have any ways of perceiving it. They don't have any ways of understanding it. They're not able to be mindful about it. They can become, they just go along with it. So part of what compassion is about, is to say that we all have brains that can be very harmful to ourselves. It can make us feel very depressed or anxious or upset or paranoid, but also can be very harmful to other people. It can be full of hate and rage. Therefore, in order to live to be compassionately, I'm going to pay attention to my brain. I'm going to pay attention to my mind. And that's where you come in. That's why your group is so wonderful, because you're telling people, you're helping people say, become mindful, become aware of a brain that you did not design. It was designed for you, not by you. You didn't design it. You have a brain that if you're not mindful, it can be very tricky. And so let's do that. So then what we do is we work on posture, we work on breathing exercises, and we're working to work that brain. Remember that frontal cortex I showed you and many other physiological systems? We want to get those systems going. We want to use our body. We want to use our brain. We want to develop practices that will do that. So using the body to support the mind. And then we can also do compassionate qualities. And here what you do is you choose a quality. It could be assertiveness, it could be mindfulness, it could be friendliness, and you practice that quality for a week or 2 weeks. Just that one quality, just practice one quality for a week or a couple of weeks. So be very specific about the quality that you're practicing. So if you're going to practice empathy, be very specific about what does that mean. If you're going to be empathic, what does that mean? What does it mean to deliberately pay attention to listening, to not reacting, to listen to the other person, to take an interest in the other person? Practice doing that, see? Or if you're going to be friendly, whatever. Then the other things are doing compassionate imagery, all the things that we do in our compassionate training. So we have ways in which we can develop our compassionate mind. And it's also important when we're developing compassion that we also develop joyfulness, because these are very, very important, aren't they? The ability to be joyful. And so coming to the end of my talk now, what I've tried to give you is the view that there are different views about the nature of humanity. One view is we are biological and we have a whole range of biological motives and emotions, which has been developed by evolution, by DNA, has built them into our brain. We didn't build them. We often don't want them, at least not some of them. Whereas the Buddhist view is that if you can see past the brain, if you can not be regulated by these biological things, if you can settle your mind, you can begin to have an experience of the nature of consciousness itself. And that takes you into non-duality. And when you begin to have when you settle the mind and begin to just be in consciousness, your experience of compassion comes from a sense of boundlessness, of being part of, or a sense of connectedness. And that sense of connectedness is fundamental to compassion. So those are two ways. Whereas in the biological way, we think that's a good thing to be doing, but also what we need to be doing is helping the individuals work with those aspects of their brain that will help them deal with the dark side, how to become mindful, how to generate compassionate mind, how to generate a compassionate brain state, so that when you are struggling with anxiety, when you're struggling with rage, when you're struggling with hatred, when you're struggling with all these things, you are able to ground yourself in your body and pull yourself or bring yourself into your compassionate mind and focus on what a compassionate position would be for that situation. Okay, so I've taken up too much of your time. Thank you so much for coming along today. I hope that's given you a bit of an overview, and I will get these slides sent to Seymour, and then you can have them. So I'm going to come out of here now and come back to Seymour. There we are.
Thank you very much, Paul, for the rich presentation, for the perspectives that you have given. It's very useful, helpful for us to develop understanding to human mind. So thank you very much. I don't know how are you about time right now, if we have time for questions, because
Yes,
there are
up
a
to
few
you.
of them in the chat.
That's completely up to you.
Yeah, okay then. So one of the questions is about I'm not sure how this tribalism is not enabling to empathize with others' pain. How brain cannot process the pain of the other because of tribalism. Yeah,
Well, you can. You certainly can. So when you see people in other countries, maybe children are dying or whatever, you can do that. The problem is, and that's great, that's good, you can do that. But it's when we then see the other or as the enemy or as not deserving, that's quite easy to trigger. And we see this all over the world, don't we? This when tribalism becomes hostile. So as I said, oxytocin can be very good for loving and caring, but it can also make us much more sensitive to in-group and out-group. So it's when we see the other as the out-group. Now, the other thing I should say is that when individuals come from a loving background, caring background, they're much more likely to be able to be compassionate to other groups. If they come from neglectful backgrounds or harsh backgrounds, it's more common that they will be hostile to other groups. It's not inevitable, it's just more common.
Thank you. And another question is that, or a comment also, you are absolutely right. When we look to the background of leaders, we see that their pasts are full of traumatic experiences, and these leaders affect the life dynamics of entire populations. But how can we be compassionate toward bad leaders who are brain damaged and deprived of empathy or toward so much evil?
Yes, that's a wonderful question. So the first thing is not to be pulled into hating them, because if you do that, then your own dark side is being stimulated. So the first thing then is to become aware that they didn't choose that. They didn't wake up and think, oh, I could be a nice leader, but I'm going to be a bad one. So they didn't choose that. However, so that's the first thing, is our own reactions to it, because we can feel sad and upset. And it's very easy for us to get angry and to hate them and, oh, these are awful. And then we've got caught up in that same dark side. So that's the first thing. The second thing, however, is you're absolutely right. We now need to think about, but how do you stop them? Okay, you may not hate them, but you have to work out how to stop them. So that's very important. And that is an issue that all of us have to be thinking about that and agree that the rule of law has to be very, very important. And that when people disobey it, as some individuals certainly do, how do we stop them? And that then takes us into real key issues. For example, how does social media generate support for these people, as opposed to undermine support for these individuals? So it's a wonderful question, because firstly, you have to make sure you don't get pulled in with your own hatred. That's very important. Otherwise, that's awful. So we have compassion for them, but nevertheless, we have to find ways in which we can stop them. And I think that's a great question. That's a question that lots of people are thinking about, politicians and philosophers. How do we, in democracies and other places, how do we stop these individuals getting into power? Because one of the things we know is that because of their trauma, they're very power hungry. They want power and they're ruthless, right? Those two qualities together make them ideal for getting power. They're manipulative. They will, so it's a great question. I don't have the answer to it, but at least we can all think together with politicians, with philosophers, with lawmakers. What do we do? Because it's been a problem for thousands of years. For thousands of years, we've had the problem of dominant, aggressive males. If you look at Roman empires, a lot of them were mad. I mean, they were just nuts, as well as pretty bad, very psychopathic. So we have to find ways of dealing with these individuals, to govern ourselves in ways that allow us to have culture, generate cultures which follow the law and are moral. And I think that's a challenge for us. I don't have the answers to it, but at least we can work on those answers.
Yeah, thank you. It's a good invitation to reflect on it, maybe
Yes, it's a great question. It's a wonderful question. But nobody's got, we have to work on it. We don't know. I mean, the United Nations are really trying to work out how they can change themselves, because they have become completely powerless. Completely, they're they've really set up as a regulating system, but they've got no power. So they have to work out how they can actually, the world, leadership by the world leaders can have power. If you have one or two people that can just ignore it and do whatever they want, that's a problem. That's a problem for the world.
Okay, so thank you for all your wisdom, for sharing with us, Paul. We would not want to take much of your time. Maybe I can pass on to Günsu if she would like to share some last comments.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So I'll get the slides to you in the next day or two. And thank you.
Çok çok teşekkür ediyoruz yeniden ve evet kabul ettiğiniz davetimizi. Bu kadar derin, içgörülü bu sunum için ve birçok soruma ben de yanıt buldum. Umarım dinleyenler de olur. Ve çok düşünmek istiyorum üzerine yeni sorular ortaya çıkacak. Ve biz
That's
bu
good.
konuşmayı YouTube kanalımızda yayınlayacağız. İzninizle
Great.
daha çok insana da ulaşması için. Evet,
You're
buradan
very
da
welcome.
isteyenler oradan tekrar izleyebilirler.
Yes. Yes.
Bu organizasyon için aynı zamanda hem Şeyma'ya ve diğer sorumluluk organizatörümüz Dilan Şahin'e ve teknik destek için Büşra'ya, Atay'a
Teşekkürler. Çevirmenlerimize de
ve
çok
evet
teşekkürler.
çevirmenlerimize de aynı şekilde. Herkese teşekkürler katıldığınız için. Hoşça kalın. İyi akşamlar.
İyi
And
akşamlar.
can I just say that because you have such an interest in compassion and people like you in the world, that's the hope, right? Because actually, in the end, compassion will succeed. But it is a battle, it is a struggle. So, but we will get there in the end. Thank you so much for taking an interest in working on compassion and bringing compassion into the world.
Thank you.
All of you.
Lütfen seslerinizi açıp güle güle diyin siz de. Herkes
Çok
Bye bye Paul.
teşekkürler.
Çok teşekkür ederim.
Thank you.
Teşekkürler. Teşekkür
Oh,
ederim.
thanks. Have a good evening, everyone.
Harikaydı.
Teşekkürler herkes için.
Thank you.
Teşekkürler.
Teşekkürler.
Ekibe teşekkürler.
Teşekkürler.
Thank you.
Thank you.